May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Well, those of you who came to our first Lenten Soup and a Movie know that on Tuesday nights I'm dealing with the Lenten theme of wilderness, the wilderness within. I'm not really dealing with it. I thought of it, but I've handed it over to some other folks to deal with in the movies and in facilitating. But in my sermons on Sunday mornings during Lent, I've taken the theme getting in touch with Jesus for each of the sermons. As I indicated last week in the message that Bob Timmons read for me, the Jesus that we're trying to get in touch with is the Jesus that we actually do encounter in the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this Jesus. And perhaps that may seem obvious to many of you, but I think quite often we try to get in touch with Jesus by trying to think of what would Jesus do in a situation, trying to imagine that. What would Jesus do? In fact, there's even a popular phrase to that effect, isn't it? What would Jesus do? I used to have a little bracelet that said that. A clergy colleague of mine recently pointed out not long ago that rather than asking what would Jesus do in any given situation, we would really do better to ask what did Jesus do and actually go look in the Gospels to see what it was, rather than just trying to imagine it for ourselves. Because sometimes what Jesus actually does do in the Gospels is different from what we would like to think he would do in some of the situations that we face in our life. So this is what I'm hoping that we'll do in these sermons and do on these Sunday mornings as we read the gospel lesson that's appointed for each Sunday in Lent. I'm hoping we'll get in touch with the Jesus who is really there to get in touch with, the one who comes across to us in those stories remembered by his disciples and those who came after his disciples of him, stories that told what he was doing. I hope we'll take a closer look at what he really did. In this morning's gospel reading from Luke, Jesus is lamenting a difficulty that both he and the prophets faced. All they had ever wanted to do was to gather the people of God under the wing of God's vision for the world. That was the whole purpose of every prophetic message. That was the whole purpose of everything Jesus said, did, acted on, was to gather. We hear his frustration in that gospel as he talks about Jerusalem who had stoned the prophets and wouldn't listen to them. And he talks about how much, he's weeping when he says this, how much he would have gathered them under the wing. And it's that wing of God's vision that he would gather them under. And this vision of God's for the world is the vision that, as I've told you before, the ancient Hebrews called shalom, and even the modern Hebrews still call it shalom, and the Arabs call it salam. I've talked about this before, but I don't think it hurts to talk about it again. In English, there's really no comparable word to shalom and salam. We use the word peace, but as I've said before, it doesn't really mean the same thing. What do you think of when you think of peace? You think of the absence of conflict. We think of maybe a calm inside of ourselves. And certainly peace, shalom, salam, means those things. But when the Hebrew says shalom, and when the Arab says salam, they mean much more than just an absence of conflict or a nice, easy feeling inside. Shalom, salam, is the fulfillment of everything that God has ever intended for all of us and for all of creation. It's the completeness of God's vision for a world where all hopes and prayers and dreams are answered with justice, truth, and love, as one of our Episcopal hymns says. It's God's dream of a world where fox-like behavior like Herod's. I love that when he says, go tell that fox, Herod. It's a dream where a world where fox-like behavior like Herod's gives way to a willingness to be gathered under the way of shalom and under the wing of shalom. This means a world where we all know that the way to promise lies not in the schemes we can devise to get what we think we need to get, or to have done what we think needs to be done. That the way to promise lies not in the force that we can use to make things happen. That instead, to be gathered under the wing of God's shalom is to trust that the way that Jesus and the prophets before him have shown is the way. And that way is a way of not having to win in the world. It is a way of not having to win in the world. There's so many ways to talk about the issues we have with living life this way, because our tendency to want to win and to want to win at all costs invades every aspect of our lives. It fuels the divisive issues that enter not only into religion and politics, but also into our relationships with one another and with the whole of God's creation. Stories abound in all of these different contexts about how our own fear of losing something that we think we have to hold on to gets square dab in the middle, leading us to a refusal to be gathered under the wing of shalom, because we've got to fight it out so we can win. You see, it's not that we don't like the idea of shalom as a dream, or as a vision for some future state, or as a remembrance of what Jesus did. We like the idea just fine. It's more that we just don't buy that dream as a reality for us, for ourselves, for our world, for now. It's hard for us to see how life can be good unless we do everything in our power to do what we have to do to win. We live in a world where foxes rule. And whether it is in religion or politics or relationships, it's hard to imagine being okay without figuring out how to outfox somebody else. But where that leaves us is in our own foxholes and far away from the dream of God. And that's what Jesus is weeping over in this morning's gospel as he looks at the city of Jerusalem, the city that by now he knows he'll die in. Jerusalem, whose very name means to see peace. Peace of the type that shalom points to. Yet the Jerusalem who then and now rarely knows peace, especially not shalom. He's weeping, not only for what will happen to him in that city, but also for what has happened before him, whenever a prophet has dared to speak shalom to a people who would not listen. And he is also weeping for what will happen in future times, in our own time, as the call to shalom continues to be spoken, but not heard. So quite possibly where this leaves us at this point, and especially in this season of Lent, is simply to lament with Jesus. To lament and weep with Jesus that we indeed are quite far from where we need to be. Because perhaps, just perhaps, if we can lament the distance, we might just begin to open our eyes to see the reality of what it takes to move to close the distance. If we can recognize a distance that is there and feel in our hearts the regret that there is such a distance between what we could be and what we are. Maybe we'd begin to take moves, step by step, even little ones, towards the shalom that we need to practice in our own lives. We spend so much time worrying about shalom on these big global scales. And yet where we could really do shalom is in our own lives, in our own relationships, with each other, with family, with friends, in our places of business, in our places of play. That's where we really have the power to care more about shalom than about winning. You see, even the smallest attempt to live shalom brings us a step closer to the shalom of God. And so as we get to know this Jesus, who would gather us under the wing of shalom today, may we get in touch with what that Jesus actually did in caring more about shalom than in winning in the eyes of the world. May we get in touch with this Jesus who weeps for what could be but is not yet. And may we be willing to be gathered under his wing of shalom.